I couldn't believe it when I went to dinner with my lawyer and saw my wife and a strange man at the next table. They were smiling like a couple, exchanging glances and surreptitious touches, like two teenagers in love oblivious to the world around them. I sat there a few feet away, my heart racing and a wave of disbelief burning in my chest. Her laughter, which for years had been the sound that soothed me, now felt like a razor cutting through my soul. She walked past me without noticing my presence, or worse, pretended not to notice. She was surrendered, an accomplice to this man, and everything in her body told me that I, the father of her children, her companion through all the difficult years, had become invisible. I felt my face burn. But not with shame. With pain. With a kind of pain that can't be shouted, but rather swallowed. I didn't make a fuss. I simply got up, paid the bill, and left, my stomach churning and my head burning. Arriving home, each step echoed the end. I entered my children's room, kissed their foreheads, and took a deep breath. They slept peacefully, unaware that that night the floor of our house was about to collapse. I packed my bags in silence. I arranged everything with a calmness I didn't even know I possessed. I chose clothes, documents, photos of the boys. I grabbed their favorite toys, the little girl's medicine, and her schoolwork folder. It was like fleeing a war no one saw begin. Had she wanted another life? Well, she would. But without the family she pretended to value. When she arrived and found the house empty, perhaps she would understand the weight of what she had thrown away. I left a simple note on the table, "You chose." So did I. And I left. What she couldn't have imagined was the impact of the silence. The abyss that would open the moment she saw the void she'd allowed to grow. The problem with cheaters is that they never think they'll be caught. They think they've mastered the game, that they control all the pieces. Only this time, the castle crumbled before checkmate. When she opened the door, smiling, perhaps still with the taste of wine and cheating in her mouth, she found a soulless home. The walls were there, but the laughter of her children, the scent of routine, the footsteps in the hallway, everything had gone with me. And in that moment, she didn't cry for me. She cried for the absence that spread through the house like a ghost. Because nothing is more frightening than the echo of a wrong choice. She tried calling me. Several times. Long messages, empty promises, rehearsed apologies. But what can be broken by lies cannot be mended by belated regret. With each ignored call, she sank deeper into remorse. And her lover? Oh, he even tried to play the understanding partner. But it only took a few weeks for him to show his true colors. Because a woman who abandons her children for a desire isn't viewed with admiration. She's viewed with suspicion. He began to feel uncomfortable with her crying, with the overflowing guilt, with the memories of what she'd given up. And then, on a normal night, like any other, he simply said he couldn't go on anymore. That she needed to sort out her life, understand what she'd done. He didn't want to be the villain, he said. But he didn't stick around to watch her fall apart. He left her there, alone, with a conscience that no longer gave her any respite. While she sank into regret, I rebuilt. I won't say it was easy. I had sleepless nights, silent crises, tears hidden from my children. But each day was a battle won. Every smile from them reminded me that I had done the right thing. I relearned how to live for us. I cooked for them, helped with their homework, became a father and mother without asking for applause. I just wanted them to feel safe. And, little by little, I became a new man. No longer one who accepted crumbs of attention. But a present father, a whole man, someone who learned to love himself through pain. Fate, always ironic, wanted me to meet someone when I least expected it. A strong, sensitive woman who had also been betrayed. Someone who understood the scar I carried. It began with casual conversations in the park, while our children played. She had a serene look, the kind that says, "I understand you," without needing words. And before I knew it, I was smiling again. Laughing at simple jokes, waiting for messages on my phone, hoping the afternoon would last a long time. It was light. Genuine. And, above all, without lies. Meanwhile, the woman who once shared my life lost herself in failed attempts at contact. She began showing up in the places she knew I frequented. She tried to reach out to the children, but their eyes no longer shone as they once did when they saw her. It was as if they'd understood that some wounds can't be healed with hugs. She saw, with her own eyes, that she'd been replaced. Not by another woman, but by the tranquility that took over our new life. And it killed her inside. One day, we met by chance. She was dejected, dark circles under her eyes, her voice trembling. She said she missed me, that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. That dinner, that damn dinner had just been an impulse, an escape from the routine. That she didn't know what she was doing. And then she said she wanted to go back. Start over. Redo history. I just looked at her, took a deep breath, and replied, "You burned the bridge." I moved on. And I left, without looking back. She cried. She begged. She tried to talk to my parents, my friends, our mutual acquaintances. But the answer was always the same: it's too late now. The time she used to cheat, I used to heal. And while she sank in regret, I blossomed in peace. Because the true punishment of someone who cheats isn't being left. It's realizing, too late, that they were truly loved. And that true love, once wounded, doesn't return to inhabit the same body. She still looks at old photos, souvenirs from trips, children's drawings with our names on them. But all she has now is the emptiness she allowed to grow. And perhaps what destroys her most, is knowing that the man she abandoned has become the man another woman would never let go. But what led that woman to betray a loving husband, a devoted father, who would give anything for his family? What happened between those two that turned a home into ruins? And how did fate cruelly and precisely return every pain she caused? The answer lies in the details leading up to that dinner. In the small, ignored gestures, the prolonged silences, the choices made in secret. And all of this is about to be revealed. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, our stories show, in a harsh and realistic way, how infidelity destroys families, corrodes feelings and leaves deep scars. The stories are fictional, but based on situations that reflect the real pain of those who were betrayed. Get ready now for a narrative shocking, intense and full of twists and turns. Press play, and feel the weight of a wrong choice. Daniel had always been a simple yet complete man. He had the tranquility of someone who found early what many spend their lives searching for: true love. He worked as a financial consultant at a modest but solid firm, and his routine was predictable and secure. He was the kind of man who preferred to get home early rather than go out for happy hour, who would trade any night out for a family dinner, and who knew all his children's school performance dates by heart. With Helena, he lived years he considered the best of his life. She was a literature professor, passionate about classical poetry, and full of dreams that seemed to have found rest in the stability of her marriage. She had a sweet laugh, a warm gaze, and a calmness that offset her husband's practical and direct sense. Their meeting was almost accidental, in a cafe near the university where she taught, but from the start, there was a connection between them that needed no explanation. Within a few months, they were sharing plans, bills, and a small apartment that, to them, seemed like a palace of promises. They were years of complicity. When their first child was born, Daniel held Helena's hand in the delivery room as if he could absorb her pain for her. The child's cry came as a symphony of confirmation. They were ready for this new phase. The house grew, the second child arrived, family trips followed, the purchase of a new car, the garden she cultivated on weekends. Everything seemed organized, like a well-written novel, the kind where you know where you want to go, even if you don't always know the exact path. Helena, with her almost artistic sensitivity, balanced the busy days with small but meaningful gestures. She put notes in the children's backpacks, prepared Daniel's favorite dish on Wednesdays, even when she was tired, and always found time to listen, even when it seemed there was nothing left to say. Daniel was never a man of grand words. He preferred to demonstrate with actions. He took turns doing household chores with her, picked up the children from school when he could leave early, and even with all his responsibilities, he never failed to remind her how grateful he was for the life they had built. He wasn't perfect, and he himself acknowledged that. He had his bad moods, his non-negotiable quirks, and his rigidity with schedules and commitments. But Helena said that was exactly what made him trustworthy. He was predictable in the best sense. He was the one who would be there. Always. As the years passed, the sparkle of novelty gave way to the solidity of everyday life. Conversations that once stretched into the wee hours gave way to comfortable silences on the living room sofa. Passionate kisses were replaced by tender touches on the shoulder and glances that spoke volumes. Dinners for two became rarer, not for lack of desire, but due to the rush of school commitments, bills to pay, and pending tasks. Still, there existed between them a bond that seemed unbreakable. Daniel, especially, believed this with an almost naive conviction. He looked at Helena and saw not only his wife, but the mother of his children, his life partner, the woman he would grow old with. Helena, on the other hand, felt everything more diffusely. She loved Daniel. She had no doubt about it. She admired his constancy, his care, his dedication. But there was a restlessness within her that, little by little, became more present. A part of her, silent and almost forgotten, seemed to want more. Perhaps no longer in the material sense, but emotional, spiritual. She began to dig out old poetry notebooks, texts she had written before getting married, memories of a youth that seemed so distant. Sometimes she looked at her own reflection in the mirror and wondered if she was still the same woman she had been. The years had left marks on her face, on her hands, but also in deeper places. Places she herself avoided visiting often. She tried not to let it show, but her smile was getting shorter and her hugs more calculated. Daniel noticed these changes, but interpreted them as natural signs of the times. He believed that phases came and went. They had faced others before, financial difficulties, health crises, worries about their children, and they all passed. It never occurred to him that something fundamental was changing. He continued to act as he always had, with the same emotional fidelity, the same effort to keep the house running, the same silent dedication he thought was sufficient. What he didn't realize was that, inside Helena, something was beginning to shift. She smiled, yes, but it no longer reached her eyes. She kissed him tenderly, but with an almost imperceptible absence. And at night, when he lay beside her, he often turned over, with a thought he preferred not to name. The children, oblivious to this silently growing tension, continued living their childhood with the energy of those who still don't understand the weight of adult choices. There were two of them, a boy and a girl, and they filled the house with their laughter, fights, and unexpected hugs. They saw in their parents an example of harmony, at least as far as they could tell. To them, the family was solid, happy, and stable. The constant presence of their father, who played ball in the yard and helped with homework, and the affection of their mother, who prepared snacks and told bedtime stories, formed a seemingly unshakable structure. And perhaps for that reason, Daniel never questioned it. He never stopped to take a closer look at what was slipping through his fingers. Weekends were peaceful. Walks in the park, visits to grandparents' houses, lazy afternoons watching old movies. There was a settled routine, a comfort in repetition. Helena, however, began seeking small escapes. She signed up for a creative writing course at a downtown bookstore, claiming she needed some time to herself. Daniel, as always, supported her. He was happy to see her engaged in something she loved. He took care of the children on those days, prepared dinner, and waited for her with an open bottle of wine and a set table, even though she sometimes arrived late, tired, and said she just wanted to take a shower and sleep. Over time, Helena began going out a little more. Literary events, dinner parties, coffee with coworkers. Daniel thought it was positive, believing it was important for her to stay active and social. And more than that, he trusted her. There was no jealousy, no distrust. To him, their love was mature, consolidated, and wouldn't be shaken by small changes in behavior. But what he didn't know, what he refused to imagine, was that behind her daily gestures and apparent normalcy, there was a space growing inside her. A space he no longer occupied as he once did. Even so, he remained the same man he'd always been. He planned vacations months in advance, carefully organized the household finances, and watched his children's performances with teary eyes. When he came home after a tiring day, just seeing them playing on the living room rug was enough to make him feel like it was all worth it. He loved his life. He loved his family. He loved with the naivete of someone who never imagined that love could be insufficient. Helena, however, could no longer ignore the growing feelings. It wasn't anger, nor resentment. It was something more subtle, yet devastating. A feeling that something had been left behind. A piece of herself she could no longer find in the life she'd led. She began to feel disconnected. To see Daniel as someone who orbited her life, but who was no longer part of its center. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, which would soon pass. But each day seemed to make her more absent. And even when he held her, she felt she was a different woman from the one who had once said yes with such certainty. The house remained organized. Routines were maintained. Appearances were preserved. But in the silence of her gestures, in the lingering glances at the window, in the absence of spontaneous touches, a story was unfolding without Daniel realizing it. He continued making plans. He thought about renewing their wedding vows on their 15th anniversary. He dreamed of traveling with her to the same place where they'd spent their honeymoon. He saved money, chose dates. Meanwhile, she lived in two worlds, the real and the invisible. What he saw and what she felt. And this distance, still unspoken, was already a harbinger of something he wasn't ready to face. And that, when it surfaced, would forever change what he understood as love, trust, and family. The weeks progressed with a seeming, almost anesthetic calm. Helena continued with her activities, her literary commitments, her evening classes, her cultural events. Daniel, immersed in his routines, didn't realize the severity of the signs, or perhaps he did, but refused to give them a name. He preferred to think it was fatigue, that they were normal day-to-day fluctuations. After all, those who love also get used to it, and mature love, as he used to tell himself, is made of choices, not impulses. He believed this strongly, and so he acted with serenity, patience, and the same dedication as always. But Helena's absences were becoming more frequent, and although she always had a plausible excuse, an event, a lecture, a dinner with classmates, there was a rehearsed tone in her answers, a disguised haste in each explanation, a visible effort to maintain the naturalness that had previously flowed so spontaneously. Daniel began to notice the long silences between one question and the next, the way she looked away when he hugged her from behind in the kitchen, the way she sometimes forgot simple things, like the date of her daughter's dance rehearsal or her father-in-law's birthday, dates that had previously been sacred to her. The first time he felt a real pang of unease was one Sunday morning. She had left early, saying she was going to a book fair, and only returned after lunch, with disheveled hair, red eyes, and a weariness that didn't match her account of the outing. She said she was tired because the event had been too crowded and too noisy. Daniel, instinctively, tried to believe her. But something inside him had stirred. That same night, he woke up and noticed she wasn't in bed. He found her on the living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket, her cell phone in hand. When he approached, she quickly put the phone away and said she couldn't sleep. He offered to make her tea, but she declined. She was strange, distant, as if every word was an effort and every response a barrier. The following days were marked by a subtle but constant tension. Helena was kind but absent. She smiled, but her eyes seemed fixed somewhere he couldn't reach. Daniel began to notice small details, deleted messages, extended shower times, hushed phone calls in the hallway. He wasn't a paranoid man, never had been. But there was something in the air that kept him awake, and doubt is a kind of poison that corrodes from within without leaving visible marks. Still, he refused to invade her privacy. He didn't snoop on her phone, he didn't question aggressively, he didn't make a fuss. He preferred to observe, silently, trying to find between the lines a less painful explanation for what he already sensed. He trusted too much. And perhaps that was precisely what prevented him from seeing the truth completely. He trusted what they had lived, what they had built, the children laughing around the house, the history they shared. But a part of him was already starting to prepare for the worst. One night, after putting the children to bed, he waited for her in the living room with a bottle of wine. He said he wanted to talk, asked if she was okay, if there was anything she wanted to share. She smiled fragilely, said everything was fine, that she was just overwhelmed, that the coursework was demanding, that she needed time for herself. He nodded, respected her, tried to get closer, but she refused the hug, saying she needed to rest. It was at that moment that Daniel felt, for the first time, that he had lost something. And I didn't know what yet. The days dragged on, and Daniel began to feel a growing emptiness. The house remained full, his commitments to his children kept the structure afloat, but his heart was already treading water among invisible debris. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that his mind was creating ghosts. But Helena's every gesture confirmed that she was far away, even though she was there. The truth, however, only revealed itself brutally on a day that, ironically, seemed promising. Daniel had scheduled a dinner with his lawyer to discuss the final stages of an investment process. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that promises to be forgotten soon after it happens. He put on his best shirt and left with a slight smile, unaware that, in a few hours, his life would change forever. The restaurant was discreet, quiet, perfect for meetings. He arrived early and chose a table in the corner, ordered a glass of wine, and waited. Meanwhile, he glanced absently at the couples around him, imagining their stories, their beginnings, their routines. It was then that his gaze stopped. A few meters away, sitting at a table near the window, was Helena. She didn't see him right away. She was with another man, middle-aged, well-dressed, with an impeccable beard and a confident smile. They were holding hands across the table. And they were laughing. They were laughing like he hadn't seen Helena laugh in years. A light, intimate laugh, filled with something he couldn't name. The sight paralyzed him. Time seemed suspended. He tried to convince himself it was a mistake. But it wasn't. The way she looked at that man, the way she leaned toward him, the way she touched his hand, everything said what he wasn't yet ready to accept. Daniel couldn't get up right away. He stood there, motionless, his heart pounding and a suffocating sensation in his chest. The lawyer arrived and noticed his expression, but Daniel simply stood and said, in a low voice, that he had to go. He left the restaurant as if fleeing a fire. The world around him seemed silent. He got into his car, started the engine, but remained still, his hands on the steering wheel and his eyes fixed on nothing. An avalanche of memories washed over him. Helena laughing with him, Helena at the altar, Helena holding her children in her arms, Helena crying with emotion at school parties. All of this now seemed like a lie he refused to believe existed. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He paced the house, looked into the children's rooms, sat on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. He considered confronting her, but something inside told him it wouldn't work. He decided he needed to act, not react. The next day, while Helena was still asleep, he got up early, made coffee for his children, packed their backpacks, and began sorting through some suitcases. He carefully chose what to take, gathering documents, toys, and essential clothing. He wrote a short note and placed it on the living room table, next to the house keys. When Helena woke, the house would be different. Empty of children's voices, truly silent. And, in the center of it all, a vast space that had previously been filled by him. As he left, Daniel didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't slam doors. He simply calmly closed the gate to the house where he had lived the happiest, and now also the most bitter, moments of his life. He took with him his children, his dignity, and a wounded heart that still didn't understand the depth of the scar it would bear. Helena, at that moment, slept peacefully, perhaps still with the scent of dinner on her body, oblivious to the earthquake she had caused. But when she returned, when she walked through that door and saw the silence where there had once been laughter, she would understand that she had crossed a line. And though she thought, for a moment, that she could regain what she had lost, she didn't yet know that there was something more, something profound, a revelation that would change not only how she saw what she had done, but also everything she thought she knew about the man she had left behind. A light rain fell on the car window as Daniel watched his sleeping children in the back seat. The home they had left behind now seemed like a parallel world, distant, almost unreal. He hadn't cried, but his chest ached as if crushed from within. He drove to a small, secluded inn, a place where they could stay for a few days while he decided what to do. Helena still didn't know anything. Or maybe she already knew, maybe she'd sensed, upon opening the door and seeing the emptiness, that her castle had crumbled. But his silence, that was a cry she hadn't expected to hear. Daniel hadn't blocked her contacts, but he ignored every message. The audio messages arrived full of pleas, the texts attempted to justify the unjustifiable. And he, there, between the innocent sleep of his children and the low rumble of the engine, felt that time had changed forever. 3 days passed before he answered. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew he needed to end it with words, with truths, with the weight of the pain he carried. He arranged to meet her in a park near the children's old school, a neutral, open place, where nothing could be broken except certainties. When Helena arrived, she looked smaller, haggard, with puffy eyes and the expression of someone who had slept too little and thought too much. He was sitting on a wooden bench, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the artificial lake ahead. She stopped a few steps away, took a deep breath, and, with a choked voice, said she needed to speak, that she needed to explain, that she had made a terrible mistake. He didn't turn around immediately. He waited a few seconds, perhaps to avoid reacting with the fury burning inside his chest. And then, when he spoke, his voice was firm, direct, like a sharp blade that had already cut 1,000 times inside before touching the air. She tried to hold his hand, but he gently pushed it away. He said he already knew everything, that he didn't need to hear excuses, that the look she'd exchanged at the restaurant said more than any confession. She choked back tears, tried to insist, saying she'd lost herself, that she no longer knew who she was, that the other man had appeared in a moment of weakness. Daniel then looked at her with cold eyes and asked if she'd even thought about the children. Helena lowered her head and said no, that she hadn't thought of anything, that she'd been selfish, that she'd acted like someone trying to escape herself. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if each word of hers were a new stab in a still open wound. He said he no longer wanted to hear promises, that all he needed from her now was distance and respect. But at that moment, while she was still searching for words to try to mend what was already torn, Daniel remembered something that had been tormenting him since dinner. A detail that, in the midst of the shock, had been muffled, but now resonated with cruel clarity. He looked at her and asked, more seriously than ever, if the man she was dining with that night knew she was a mother. Helena hesitated. The expression on her face changed suddenly, as if she hadn't expected the question. She tried to hide it, saying she didn't remember, that perhaps they hadn't discussed it yet. Daniel frowned and interrupted her. He said he had something to tell her. Something she hadn't expected. Something he had discovered after leaving the restaurant, when the pain was still fresh, but the anger was already beginning to transform into clarity. After dinner, he was overcome by a restlessness that wouldn't let him rest. He decided he needed to know who the man was. Not out of jealousy, but because he needed to understand who had occupied his space. He used every means at his disposal, and it didn't take long to discover the name. The man was well known in town, the owner of a small art studio, discreet and reserved, but who frequented the same literary circles as Helena. And it was in an online discussion forum, open to the public, that Daniel saw something that froze his blood. The man had posted a long text, full of elaborate phrases, extolling the beauty of a woman, free, without ties, without children, without old stories to drag along. The post was posted 2 days before dinner. In the text, he described his muse as someone freeing herself from an oppressive past, who finally found space to live without burden. Daniel looked at Helena with the expression of someone who had just seen her soul bare, and said in a hard voice that he knew she had lied about her children. He knew that, for that man, she was pretending to be someone else, someone without responsibilities, someone without roots. Helena tried to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. She stammered, gasped for air, and then burst into tears. She said she didn't know how to explain it, that at first it was just a flirtation, a way to feel alive, that she hadn't intended things to go this far, that she had lied because she wanted to be someone else, to forget for a moment the weight of motherhood, of routine, of the life she felt slipping through her fingers. Daniel just listened to her, expressionless. Inside, a part of her was shattering, but her face remained impassive. She then said, with calculated coldness, that she hadn't just betrayed a husband. She had betrayed her children. She had chosen to erase their existence to fit into a stranger's fantasy. Helena fell to her knees on the park floor, sobbing like a child. She said she regretted it, that she didn't know what to do, that she just wanted him back, her children back, that she could make amends. But Daniel was unmoved. He said there were limits. And that once you cross certain lines, there's no going back. The pain in his eyes was clear, but the love had died. She begged to see them, to talk to the children. She said she hadn't committed any crime, that she was still their mother. He replied that perhaps she needed to become human again first. And with that, he got up and walked away, leaving her there, kneeling in the park mud, her clothes soaked with regret and her heart shattered by the truth she herself chose to deny. The following days were like a whirlwind. Helena tried every way to reconnect, but Daniel kept his distance. His children, when questioned, said they didn't want to talk to their mother. They felt angry, confused, and missed her. But more than anything, they felt something had been broken. Daniel welcomed them with patience and love, answering their questions with enough honesty to protect their remaining innocence. Little by little, they rebuilt a new routine. Simpler, leaner, but full of genuine affection. He cooked, drove them to school, watched movies with them on weekends. There was pain, but there was truth. And truth, even harsh, has the beauty of liberating. Helena, on the other hand, was sinking. Her relationship with her lover couldn't withstand the revelation. When he discovered she had lied about having children, about being married, about everything, he disappeared. He said he couldn't handle such omission. That she had sold a version of herself that didn't exist. That what they experienced was based on a character, not a real woman. And so, coldly and cowardly, he turned his back. Helena tried to find support in her friends, but many turned away. Those who knew her as a mother, as a wife, were shocked by the depth of what she had done. She was left with silence. And in that silence, the weight of her choices remained. She was now a woman who denied her own children, who hid her story, who destroyed what was most sacred to her in the name of an illusion. But nothing destroyed her more than the memory of Daniel's eyes in the park. There was no shouting, no insult, no open anger. There was disappointment. There was a silent mourning of someone she had loved deeply and who, for that very reason, could no longer love. This absence of resentment was worse than any fury. Because it made it clear he no longer held space for her. No pain, no longing, no hope. Only emptiness. She walked past the places they used to go. He stopped in front of the children's school, pretending he was just passing through. I went to the market where they used to shop together. I sat on the park benches where they used to laugh as a family. But everything seemed in another dimension now, as if life had gone on without her. Because it had. And deep down, she knew she deserved it. He knew he had chosen to erase what was most true. And now, all that remained was the echo of a home that no longer existed. Daniel's life took on a new shape, and even without asking, he found himself forced to take on responsibilities he'd previously shared with Helena. Now, he prepared meals, arranged the children's uniforms, attended school meetings alone, and still maintained his work with impeccable professionalism. There were days when physical exhaustion nearly felled him, but the strength that drove him came from a place even he didn't fully understand. He felt the need to keep his children grounded, protected from what they couldn't understand. He knew that sooner or later they would have more difficult questions, but for now, it was enough to be present, with affection, patience, and a love he never doubted existed. Helena tried everything. She called, texted, asked to see her children, said she wanted to talk to them in person. Daniel, calmly and respectfully, simply replied that it wasn't the right time yet. He wanted his children to have time to process, to heal. And deep down, he still struggled with his own open wound. The image of her kneeling in the park, begging for forgiveness, still haunted him some late nights. But not out of pity. It was the memory of the exact moment he knew their love had died, irreversibly. Something inside him had broken, and as much as he didn't want to live in the shadow of pain, it was impossible to forget. What Helena destroyed was more than a relationship. She severed the bond that sustained his image of her as a woman, mother, and companion. Months of silence passed. Until one day, unexpectedly, Daniel received a call from the school. The coordinator informed him that Helena was at the front desk, asking to see her children. She had said it was an important day for her and that she couldn't stand the distance any longer. Daniel, upon hearing this, felt a chill run down his spine. He asked that his children not be exposed to anything without his consent, and went to the school himself. Upon arriving, he found Helena outside, sitting on the curb, a cardboard box in her arms. When he saw him, she stood up quickly, her eyes red, her hair tied up messily, and a desperate expression on her face. He crossed his arms, keeping his distance, and asked what she wanted there. She said she needed to see them, that she had prepared something special, that she had made an album with photos and letters, and that she wanted to deliver it in person. She said she wasn't there to apologize or force anything. She just wanted them to know she loved them. Daniel looked at the box, then back at her, and took a deep breath. He said he'd take the materials home and that they could look at them if they wanted. But he wouldn't allow any unauthorized meetings. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and handed over the box without hesitation. That night, Daniel put his children to bed and stared at the box for hours. He didn't open it right away. He was afraid of what he would find there. When he finally did, he found dozens of old photos, drawings of the children, handwritten letters with dates in the corners. Helena had recorded moments, phrases, special dates. In each letter, she apologized to her children, told stories from their childhood, recalled trips, small gestures, silly but meaningful moments. It was a silent plea. And Daniel, despite everything, felt a tightness in his chest. He knew she loved them, but what she did went beyond love. Love, for him, had always been synonymous with responsibility, with presence. And she had broken that the moment she decided to erase her children from her own narrative. He then decided to talk to his children. Calmly, he explained what he had received, showed them the box, and told them they could see it if they wanted. Their reactions were different. The girl, more sensitive, wanted to see it immediately. She took the letters, leafed through the album, and read the text silently, her eyes welling up. The boy hesitated, stood with his arms crossed, and only finally approached for a quick glance. Neither of them said anything at that moment. They simply put their things back and went to sleep. But in the early hours of the morning, Daniel heard footsteps in the hallway. He found his daughter sitting on the stairs, hugging the box, crying silently. He sat beside her, put his arm around her, and let her vent. She said she missed her mother but didn't know if she could trust her. That she was confused, angry, homesick, all at once. And he simply listened, without interrupting, his heart aching. Meanwhile, Helena sank deeper into her own absence. She had permanently distanced herself from her lover. He refused to contact her anymore, and she lacked the strength to insist. She spent her days trying to rebuild herself, working what she could, living in seclusion, far from anything that reminded her of her old life. Every corner of the house where she lived alone was a memory that hurt her. The absence of her children was a hole that grew inside her like a constant echo. She tried therapy, read books about guilt, and sought some spirituality that would help her find redemption. But no theory could account for the emptiness. Because the forgiveness she most desired wasn't that of others. It was her own. And she still couldn't forgive herself. A month after the school incident, Daniel took his children to a local music festival. He wanted them to reconnect with life, with joy. As they walked between stalls and stages, they passed a woman working at a children's reading booth. She was a volunteer, an art teacher, with a soft smile and a calm gaze. Her name was Laura. The conversation was brief and cordial. She offered the children drawings and activities, and at the end of the day, Daniel thanked her with a sincere smile. Their subsequent encounters were casual, at other fairs, at school events, at neighborhood gatherings. Until one day, during a reading workshop, the two began to truly talk. She was a widow, the mother of a boy who attended the same school. She had been through her own storm, and the way she spoke about life was always down to earth, without great expectations, but with a kindness Daniel had forgotten existed. Conversations with Laura became frequent. First in the hallways, then in cafes, and gradually on longer walks. The children got along well. They played together, laughed, created games and stories. For the first time in months, Daniel felt something inside him reorganize. It wasn't love yet. It was peace. And after so long living with pain, realizing that peace could exist was almost a miracle. Laura didn't force anything. She listened, respected his time, and never tried to replace anything. She was simply there, with a real and silent presence. One day, during a conversation on the porch, Daniel confided in her that he still wasn't sure if he believed in love again. She smiled and told him he didn't need to believe, just feel. That love wasn't something promised, but something built. He fell silent, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the urge to stay. Helena, for her part, continued trying to find ways to reconnect. She sent letters and simple gifts, always careful not to intrude. One day, Daniel decided to respond. He wrote a direct, respectful email, saying the children were fine, that they were still in pain, but that he was willing to allow a reunion, as long as it was during their time. He set a date, at a neutral location, and let the children decide whether they wanted to attend. They both agreed, their expressions tense but without resistance. Helena received the news with a mixture of joy and dread. She spent days preparing what she would say, rehearsing how to introduce herself, how to face her own children after so long. On the day of the meeting, she dressed simply, but with a care she hadn't shown in a long time. When she saw them arriving, her heart raced. The children were older, more mature. They had a strength in their eyes she couldn't remember seeing before. The conversation began tensely. The children kept their distance, their eyes wary. She tried to speak, but her words tangled. She apologized. He said he knew he had done something unforgivable. He understood if they no longer wanted to see her. But he couldn't go on without trying. His daughter cried, but came closer. He touched her hand, still afraid, and said he missed her, but he was scared. The boy was harsher. He said he was still angry, that he didn't understand how she could do that, but that perhaps, in time, he could forgive. Helena wept silently. The reunion was brief, restrained, but real. And in it, there was something powerful. Not a complete reconciliation, but a glimmer of light. Daniel watched from afar. He saw everything without intervening. When his children returned, he asked how they felt, and they both said they were confused but relieved. That, somehow, they needed this. He hugged them tightly and felt that, perhaps, time was beginning to do its work. Not to forget, but to transform. That same night, when he got home, Daniel prepared a simple dinner and called Laura. He said he wanted to see her. When she arrived, the children were watching a movie, and he took her out to the garden. He told her about the meeting, about the mixed feelings, about the memories that still hurt. Laura listened in silence. And then, without saying anything, she simply hugged him. A hug without haste, without intentions. A hug that said, "I'm here." And for the first time since it all began, Daniel felt that hug wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. The days that followed that reunion were filled with calmer silences and more restrained gestures. There was no complete forgiveness, no re-established bonds, but there was a path, albeit shaky, emerging between the pain of the past and the possibility of a less hostile future. Daniel watched his children with a mixture of pride and unease. He knew that, deep inside, they still faced a deep conflict. It wasn't just the longing for their mother that consumed them, but the discomfort of not knowing what to do with everything they felt. Contradictory feelings like anger, compassion, sadness, and longing coexisted within them as if they were simultaneous storms in the same sky. Daniel tried to help them with listening and patience, but he knew there was pain that not even a father's love could heal alone. And this tortured him more than any memory. He found himself, once again, powerless in the face of suffering that he hadn't caused, but that fell upon him to be embraced. Time passed. Helena continued her journey of internal reconstruction. Daniel gradually allowed his children to spend more time with her, on their own terms. Laura became part of this new reality, with respect and lightness. And what was once a field of emotional ruins now organized itself into a new landscape, with traces of the past, but with real possibilities for the future. The story didn't end there, but the weight of choices began to be digested. Each character, in their own way, faced the ghosts of what they had experienced, and none of them were free from scars. But perhaps healing was precisely that, moving forward, even when the pain still throbs, because there is something stronger calling forward. And the moral dilemma remained alive, not as a question, but as a memory. Because in life, certain mistakes cannot be undone, but always carry transformative lessons. And that was what remained now, the challenge of continuing to live, even knowing what was lost. As summer began to show signs of arrival, the air seemed lighter in the mornings, and the children's smiles began to appear more naturally, as if time had invisibly worked silent repairs. Daniel, now more settled in his emotional reconstruction, found himself overcome by a strange sense of relief and nostalgia whenever he watched his children sleeping peacefully. Memories still persisted, echoing back, especially on nights when the silent house brought back the weight of absence and transformation, but they no longer hurt as before. Suffering had given way to a kind of emotional maturity he hadn't known he possessed. He was, for the first time in a long time, proud of himself. Laura, who remained a constant presence, was becoming an emotional pillar not only for Daniel but also for their children. It was impressive how she knew how to occupy space without stealing the spotlight. She had a delicate sense of how far she could go, when to remain silent, and when to act. One Saturday afternoon, while the children played in Laura's backyard with her son, Daniel and she were alone for a few minutes in the kitchen, preparing a snack. It was at that moment that Laura looked at him with a slight smile and asked if he had ever thought about truly starting over. Daniel found the question strange and replied that he felt like he was already starting over. But she shook her head tenderly and said that sometimes we get used to rebuilding and forget that, after rebuilding everything, we need to open the door for life to enter. The words echoed in his mind for days. Meanwhile, Helena was also experiencing a transformation that was invisible to others but consumed every ounce of her emotional energy. She had accepted a temporary job as an assistant at a community library. Surrounded by books and silence, she found solace there. She spent her days organizing shelves, suggesting reading material for disinterested teenagers, and writing in her old notebook, the same one where, months earlier, she had begun recording everything she felt. One day, at the end of her shift, she found a mother and daughter talking about a book on reconciliation between parents and children. She observed that moment as if it were a scene from a movie. And in that instant, she had the idea to transform her own writings into something greater. Not to justify herself, but to offer others a true perspective on what happens when ego overcomes love. Daniel only learned of this decision weeks later, when Helena sent, without warning, a printed draft of what would be the first chapter of a book. Enclosed was a letter: "I don't want this published if you or the children don't want it. But I need to try to make something good out of the pain I've caused." Daniel read the text in silence, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table. The words were harsh, honest, neither hiding flaws nor softening truths. It was a raw but humane account. He didn't respond immediately. It took him a few days to digest. When he finally spoke to her, it was by phone. He said he didn't know if the book was a good idea, that he feared reopening wounds that were just beginning to heal, but that he also recognized the courage in exposing himself in that way. Helena accepted his position without drama. She said she just needed to hear it from him. The children, in turn, were also at different stages of this rebuilding process. The daughter, growing closer to her mother, began spending some weekends with her. There was still hurt, yes, but there was also a clear desire to rebuild some possible relationship. The son, however, kept his distance. He was polite, respectful, but emotionally closed off. Daniel tried to talk to him a few times, suggesting therapy and group activities, but the boy refused. Until one day, on the way home, he uttered a phrase Daniel hadn't expected. "I can't forgive someone who chose to forget I existed." Not yet. Daniel didn't try to console or correct him. He simply placed his hand on his son's shoulder and told him he had every right to feel that way. It was this kind of listening he had learned to cultivate. Their meetings with Laura became more frequent, and one rainy late afternoon, as they watched their children play dominoes on the living room floor, Daniel lightly touched her hand and asked if she wanted to build something more together. Laura smiled with her eyes, as if she had expected the question but knew how to wait for the right moment. She answered yes. And in that moment, without exaggerated promises or theatrical declarations, they sealed the beginning of something real. They decided to travel together with the children for the next holiday. Nothing too elaborate, just a few days in a quiet city, where they could enjoy themselves without pressure, away from prying eyes and the weight of unresolved stories. Upon learning this, Helena felt an unexpected shock. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't a desire to get back together, it was the definitive realization that Daniel had moved on. Not with bitterness or indifference, but with completeness. And this, for her, was like a silent sentence. She cried alone in her bed that night. She considered calling, writing, saying something. But, for the first time, she decided to do nothing. She accepted. And acceptance, at that point in her journey, was her greatest breakthrough. She kept writing. The book gained new chapters, based not only on her story, but on the stories she heard from other women, other mothers, other losses. It was beginning to become something bigger. She received an offer to present part of the project at a small local literary gathering. Daniel, when invited, decided to go. He didn't tell his children. He wanted to watch in silence. He sat in the back of the room, discreetly. And saw, to his surprise, a woman who was no longer the same. Helena took the stage with a shaky but confident voice. She read excerpts from the book with careful pauses. She spoke of rash choices, of wounds we don't see right away but that bleed for years. She said her biggest mistake was betraying herself first, believing it was possible to erase parts of her own life without consequences. And that, today, her mission was to warn others in time. At the end of the reading, there was silence. A silence that didn't judge, but respected. Daniel felt something dissolve inside him. It wasn't forgiveness yet. But it was relief. The bond with Laura grew stronger every day, but there was no rush between them. They both knew the value of time and understood that certain wounds, if touched with anxiety, reopen. Laura respected Daniel's children's space, didn't try to occupy places that weren't hers, simply offering presence, listening, and affection in small gestures. Sunday lunches began to include her son, and little by little, the four of them seemed to form a new family structure, still under construction, but full of care. Daniel never hid his story from Laura. He spoke openly about what he'd experienced, what he'd lost, what remained. And Laura, instead of distancing herself from his pain, approached him with rare empathy. She, too, knew what it was like to lose a love, what it was like to start over with a mended heart. Therefore, she never promised levity. She offered truth. And truth, at that point in Daniel's life, was the most valuable thing. Helena, on the other hand, was immersed in an internal process from which there was no turning back. She had passed the stage of denial, of the desperate attempt to urgently fix things. Now, she was dealing with the raw consequences of what she had caused. She realized that the letters, the gifts, the carefully organized meetings didn't erase the past. That there was no guarantee of winning her back. Her every gesture was received politely, but without enthusiasm. Her children responded, but without a sparkle in their eyes. Daniel allowed contact, but never went beyond what was necessary. It was as if she were present in a parallel reality, where everything she did was filtered by emotional distance. She still loved her children, but understood that love alone wasn't enough. Trust needed to be built. And trust, as she now knew, was the kind of structure that, once demolished, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Some time later, Helena received an invitation to participate in a mother's circle at school, an event focused on topics such as family reconciliation, active listening, and rebuilding bonds. She hesitated. She knew she would encounter judgment and disapproving looks. But she decided to go. Not to redeem herself, but because she felt the need to listen to other pains. In the circle, she heard mothers talk about distances they didn't choose, others about mistakes they tried to repair, some about forgiveness that never came. For the first time in a long time, Helena spoke without trying to justify herself. She said she had betrayed her children's trust, that she had abandoned her essence, that she had lied to herself. And that now, everything she did was to try to be someone they could look at without pain. Many of the women there stared at her in silence. Some offered words of support. Others simply listened with respect. But in that moment, Helena realized that true repentance wasn't a speech, it was a way of being. And she now existed in constant repentance. Daniel learned about the event later. Someone commented, showed him a photo, said she spoke with courage and humility. He didn't react emotionally. He simply absorbed the information and continued his routine. Inside, something stirred. Not for her, but for his children. He began to wonder if it might be time to open a wider gap so that they, if they wanted, could establish a new relationship with their mother. He spoke to them calmly. He explained that everyone had their own time, their right to feel. That no one was obliged to forgive, but that neither should one carry eternal grudges. That sometimes, releasing some of the burden was also an act of self-love. They both listened. The girl, more willing, said she wanted to have lunch with her mother. The boy was still reluctant, but said he would think about it. Daniel respected her. And he scheduled the lunch. At a discreet, neutral restaurant, without pressure. The meeting was tense, but not hostile. Helena was visibly nervous. The girl talked about school, her friends, and asked about her mother's work. Helena responded gently, without trying to exaggerate. The boy kept his gaze downcast, his arms crossed. But at the end of the meal, he accepted a dessert she ordered for him. And that, in that context, was a huge gesture. After lunch, Daniel drove them home and, as he drove, he listened to their loose comments about the meeting. He noticed there was less harshness. Perhaps not forgiveness, but a weariness of anger. And that was a sign of progress. It stirred him. Not with a desire to make amends, but with the feeling that he was, at last, guiding his children out of a suffocating pain. The following week, Laura invited Daniel to spend the weekend with the children in a country house she had inherited from her grandparents. It was a simple place, but surrounded by greenery, with a small lake and silent nights. He accepted. And the days there were like a pause in time. The children ran through the woods, played cards, and improvised fishing. At night, they built a campfire, told stories, and shared silences without making them uncomfortable. Daniel and Laura shared a look that dispensed with words. It was a quiet peace, yet so intense that it made everything seem new. One of those nights, after everyone had gone to sleep, Laura told Daniel that she didn't know how their relationship would evolve, but that she was grateful to be there, with him and the children. He replied that he didn't know the future either, but that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to try. Meanwhile, Helena wrote. She began recording in her diaries everything she experienced, thought, and felt. It was a way to keep from going mad. She decided to turn her pain into words, not to expose herself, but to understand herself. One day, she sent Daniel a long letter. She asked for nothing. She simply told him how she saw things now. She said that if she could go back in time, she would have told herself the truth long before she cheated. That she understood that her greatest loss wasn't her marriage, but the version of herself that existed when she was still able to be proud of what she had built. And that, even unintentionally, she had condemned her children to an emotional scar that might never disappear. At the end of the letter, she asked only that he care for the children as he always had, because if there was anyone in the world she trusted, it was him. Daniel read it with teary eyes, but without anger. Just with calm grief. And he responded, days later, with a short email, saying she had done the right thing by acknowledging what she had done. And that, perhaps, in the future, her children would see her with less pain and more humanity. On the trip with Laura and their children, everything went surprisingly smoothly. They rode bikes, cooked together, and told bedtime stories. There was no talk of the past. Only moments of the present. One of those nights, as he watched the three of them sleeping on the couch, Daniel got up, went to the balcony, looked at the clear sky, and took a deep breath. For the first time, he felt the worst was over. That the chaos, though not forgotten, no longer controlled his steps. He was finally free. The moral dilemma that had plagued his life in recent months remained in his memory. But now, he no longer struggled with it. He had accepted that he didn't have all the answers. That certain questions existed not to be resolved, but to remind us of what we are capable of losing when we stop looking to those who walk beside us. And that betrayal, more than an isolated act, is a reflection of how much we can neglect what is most precious, the trust of those who love us. Daniel knew the journey would still have its ups and downs. That his relationship with Helena, no matter how civilized it became, would never return to what it had been. That his children would take time to heal. And that he himself would long carry the memory of a pain that transformed him. But now, with Laura by his side, with his children growing stronger, and with a history that no longer defined him, he was ready for whatever lay ahead. The past, at last, had fallen into place. And the future, for the first time, seemed possible. Time, with its persistent silence and inevitable rhythm, continued to play its role, rearranging pieces, rearranging feelings, putting people in their rightful places, not those of comfort, but those of truth. Months had passed since the trip, since the silent reunion between souls who had once lived together and now existed in parallel realities, separated by irreversible choices. Helena continued her life with discreet discipline. The book, which had begun as an intimate catharsis, became sought after by small independent publishers and eventually earned her space in reading circles, lectures, and even an invitation to appear on a regional talk show. It wasn't fame she sought, nor would it be what would bring her peace. But the unexpected impact of the work reassured her that her pain, even irreversible, could serve as a beacon for anyone about to make the same mistakes. Behind the scenes of these achievements, her loneliness still throbbed. She no longer found room to engage emotionally with anyone, for the comparison with what she had destroyed was inevitable. She tried twice to open herself up to new relationships, but both times she realized she was searching for something that no longer existed. More than losing Daniel, she had lost the version of herself that was capable of true love. And this absence, silent and definitive, was her greatest condemnation. The children, in turn, found their own paths through the wreckage of their abruptly altered childhood. The girl, now more of a teenager, had found an escape in art. She spent hours drawing, painting, creating small visual diaries about everything she felt. In one of these notebooks, there was a drawing of her mother with broken wings, sitting on the side of a road, gazing at the horizon. It was clear that the image was not made with anger, but with painful compassion. The boy, more restrained, began to excel in sports. The discipline of training, the intense routine, and clear goals gave him an emotional structure he had not yet found in relationships. He was still distant with his mother, although he accepted occasional meetings. But with every look he gave her, it was possible to sense there was no hatred, only the shadow of a trust that was never rebuilt. And Helena, in each of these looks, recognized the price of the choice she made. Daniel and Laura, now officially together, decided to take it a step further. They rented a new house, where they could create a space that was theirs alone. A home that wouldn't carry painful memories, but could be filled with new experiences. The children received the news calmly. There was a mature acceptance that this new chapter wasn't a break with the past, but a necessary reorganization. While moving, Daniel found an old box of letters he'd never given to Helena, written during the early days of their separation. They were filled with pain, anger, and confusion. He read some of them silently, then tore them up one by one. Not out of revenge, but because it no longer made sense to keep them. What he needed to say had already been said, not with words, but with actions. In their new home, things weren't perfect, but they were real. Laura faced the challenge of living with a past that wasn't hers, but which constantly impacted her present. She had bouts of insecurity, moments of doubt, fear of being just a patch. But Daniel made a point of reaffirming, with his actions, that she wasn't a replacement, but a new choice. On one of those nights when his insecurities grew more intense, he looked into her eyes and said that if he had to go through it all again, just to reach that moment with her, he would. Laura wept silently. And those tears were of relief, of belonging, of love that, even after everything, was still possible. One afternoon, Helena was invited to give a lecture at a university. The topic was the transformative power of vulnerability. He took the stage with the same resigned calm as always. At the end of his talk, a young woman approached him and asked how she managed to carry on after losing everything. Helena replied that the secret wasn't to carry on, but to accept that certain losses can't be compensated. She said that some mistakes can't be erased, but that if we have the courage to face them, we can at least avoid making the same mistake twice. The young woman smiled, thanked him, and said that his words had prevented her from making a decision she knew she couldn't reverse. Helena smiled back. And in that gesture, however small, he felt a sense of purpose that gave meaning to the pain he carried. Years passed. Not many, but enough for the pain to cease being an open wound and become a scar. Daniel decided to write a letter to his children, to be read only when they were adults. It didn't speak of betrayal, guilt, or hurt. It spoke of choices. He said that loving someone is choosing every day not to disappoint them. That love is not just a beautiful feeling, but a profound responsibility. And that, even in the face of the pain they experienced, he hoped they wouldn't grow up afraid to love, but with the courage to do so truly. The letter was kept in a blue envelope, hidden in a drawer in his office. It was a kind of silent legacy. Laura, after a long time, suggested a trip abroad with her children. She said she wanted to show them the world, to make them see that, even after everything, there was still beauty. During that trip, Daniel, as they walked across an ancient stone bridge, stopped, looked up at the reddish sky, and felt a lump in his throat. In that moment, he realized he had survived his own ruin. And that now, more than surviving, he was living. He hugged Laura and the children, without saying a word. But that gesture was understood by everyone. Helena, for her part, never loved again. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew the kind of love she had lost wasn't common. She became a reference in support groups, a voice who spoke with authority about the consequences of betrayal. She presented herself neither as a victim nor as a martyr. Simply as someone who lived to tell, and warn. Her meetings with her children, though rare, became calmer. Her daughter, now more mature, looked at her with empathy. Her son, more reserved, once told her that he understood that everyone makes mistakes, but that he hoped she knew what he lost because of it. She replied that she knew. That she knew every day. Daniel, now with gray hair and a serenity he hadn't before, was sitting in his garden one morning, watching Laura and her children laugh in the kitchen, when he felt a peace so profound he couldn't hold back a tear. It wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. Gratitude for having resisted, for having chosen to move forward with dignity, for not letting pain corrupt who he was. For having transformed an abyss into a path. For having been strong enough to teach his children that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way to get back up, as long as you're willing to do it with truth. If you've listened to this story so far, share your thoughts on this journey in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts on each character, the outcome, the choices made, and the consequences experienced. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, your participation is what makes these stories come to life. And may this story serve as a profound reflection. Betrayal is not just a character flaw, it is a wound that spans generations, that breaks the invisible, that destroys the purest foundation of any relationship, trust. Love demands truth, presence, and responsibility. When these pieces are broken, what remains is not silence, but emptiness. And it is not always possible to rebuild what has been shattered. This channel does not, in any way, support any type of cheating. Here, we truthfully and profoundly show the impact of bad decisions and the real toll they take on people's lives. Until the next story.